My name is Suzanne, and I am 34 years old. Christmas at my mother's house always felt more like a silent competition than a holiday, like the whole evening was built to measure who was thriving and who was coasting, while pretending it was about togetherness. Each year, she hosted what she dramatically called the family banquet, and each year she found new ways to wrap a judgment in a smile, a compliment in a blade, and tradition in pressure. This year I had a bad feeling walking in, the kind that sits behind your ribs before anything even happens, and I tried to ignore it because Sophie was excited in a way that made me want to believe I could give her one normal night. Evan squeezed my hand before we stepped through the front door, not hard, just enough to anchor me, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my husband felt like the safest place in the world, while the house I grew up in felt like a stage I could never perform on correctly. Our daughter Sophie, 9, had spent the last week rehearsing a little Christmas poem she wrote for Grandma, and she was so proud of it that she'd even made a drawing to go with it, folded carefully like it was important enough to be protected from the air. Evan wanted this to be special for her, a clean memory, something she could look back on without that familiar knot in her stomach, and I wanted that too, but a deeper part of me just wanted to survive the night without watching my child learn the same lesson I learned too young. It didn't take long to see where the night was going. The living room already looked like a furniture showroom, white couches no one was allowed to sit on, fake candles flickering like a Hallmark ad, and a massive tree decorated in silver and gold that felt less like joy and more like proof. Sophie walked in holding her drawing wide-eyed, looking around like she was stepping into a winter wonderland, and my mother barely acknowledged her before rushing over to greet my sister Vanessa, who had just arrived like she was late to accept her award. Vanessa's sons were wearing matching blazers and brought homemade chutney jars with printed labels, and my mom acted like they descended from heaven, gushing over them in that breathy voice she only used when she was proud in a way she wanted the room to witness. Sophie tried to hand over her gift anyway, quiet and hopeful, and my mother smiled without looking at it and told her to put it under the tree and save it for later. It was a small moment, the kind no one else would call cruel, but I watched Sophie's hands hesitate as she lowered the drawing like she'd suddenly become unsure of her own offering, and I felt something hot rise in my chest, because I knew later meant never in my mother's world when it came to things that weren't impressive enough. Dinner was loud, the wine was flowing, and so were the backhanded compliments. My mother started going around the table, catching up on everyone's accomplishments, which always meant pointing out who had done what and who hadn't, and the conversation turned into a highlight reel, where Vanessa's family was always the feature and everyone else was background noise. Vanessa's kids won a robotics tournament, her husband got a big promotion, they'd booked a European cruise, and she talked about all of it like she was the one achieving it, like her children's successes were trophies she carried in her purse. I saw Sophie watching, trying to follow, trying to find a place to fit, and I wanted to tell her she didn't have to earn love with medals, but the table was full of people who believed love was something you qualified for. Then came the toast. Everyone had just gotten their second round of wine. The room had loosened in that dangerous way, and my mother stood up with a theatrical pause, like she was about to deliver a speech she'd been rehearsing in her head all day. She raised her glass and smiled, in a way that made my skin tighten. "Some grandkids earned their place at this table," she said, and then she glanced directly at Sophie and smirked. The laughter wasn't loud, and that was what made it worse. It was knowing, nods and chuckles, and little side glances like they were all in on the joke. Vanessa didn't laugh, but she smiled the way she always does when she wants to pretend she didn't hear something awful while still enjoying it. One of her sons elbowed the other, and I saw Sophie slowly look down at her plate like the food had suddenly become too heavy to face. I couldn't move. My throat went dry. I stared at my mother, waiting for her to correct herself, to soften it, to add something that would make it less pointed, and she didn't. She let it hang there like a verdict. I looked at Evan, and the expression on his face wasn't shocked. It was quiet, steady, and final, like a door closing without being slammed. He reached for his glass and tapped it once, the sound small but sharp in the silence that followed, and he said, "While some adults earn their place in our lives." It was like someone flipped a switch. My aunt looked down at her lap. Vanessa stiffened. My father blinked at his plate like he'd forgotten how to eat. My mother's smile faltered for the first time that night, not because she felt guilty, but because someone had just challenged her in front of witnesses. Then Evan stood up. He looked at me and then at Sophie, and he told us it was time to go. My mother's voice lifted immediately, sharp with disbelief. "That's it," she said. "You're leaving." Over that, she implied, as if cruelty could be measured in single sentences and dismissed as harmless. We didn't answer. I helped Sophie into her coat, and her drawing was still folded in her lap, untouched, like it had never existed in the room at all. I grabbed it and tucked it into my bag, and my hands were shaking so slightly I hated myself for it, because I didn't want my daughter to see that my mother could still reach into me like that. As we walked toward the door, I heard my mom mutter something under her breath about how we were always sensitive and how maybe that was why Sophie struggled, and the words were so casually cruel it almost didn't register until the sting landed. Then came the yelling, louder, messier, as if volume could make her right. "You don't walk out on your family on Christmas," she said. "Don't be ridiculous, as if walking out was the offense and not what she'd done at the table." Evan opened the front door and the cold air rushed in, clean and sharp, and it was already snowing. As we walked to the car, I heard the door open again, and my mother followed us out barefoot, standing in the snow with her arms crossed, like she was the wronged one. "You're not going to cut us off over a harmless comment," she snapped. "Grow up!" She looked around like someone might be watching, like she wanted witnesses to her version of the story, and I realized that even now she cared more about how it looked than what it did to Sophie. We didn't even turn around. Evan opened the car, got Sophie in, and then came around for me, and when we drove off, I looked in the side mirror and saw my mother still standing there, arms wrapped around herself now, like she wasn't sure what had just happened. We drove home in silence. Sophie eventually fell asleep in the back seat, and when we got home, I took her drawing out of my bag and unfolded it carefully at the kitchen counter. It was a simple Christmas tree with stick figures of her, me, and Evan smiling, and above it she'd written, "My favorite people," like she was trying to give something pure to someone who only valued what looked impressive from the outside. That was the last Christmas we spent at my mother's house, but it wasn't the end, not even close, because the moment you stop playing your role in a family like mine, they don't just get angry, they get strategic. And Evan's silence on the drive home told me he wasn't going to let them turn our daughter into a punchline without paying for it. The silence didn't last long. We hadn't even unpacked our overnight bags when the calls started, one after the other like they were passing the phone around and taking turns pretending they cared. First it was voicemails laced with fake concern, my mother's voice soft and careful, saying she just wanted to make sure we got home safe, that Sophie didn't seem too upset, that everyone's emotions had been high and maybe things were misunderstood. Then it was my dad, less emotional but just as calculated, saying the holiday had been stressful and we should talk like adults instead of acting impulsively. Then Vanessa, who didn't bother with softness, finally sent a text that said, "So, you're proud of yourselves. Hope it was worth the drama." The word drama was her favorite weapon because it made cruelty sound like entertainment and made any boundary look like a tantrum. I didn't reply to any of it. I kept my phone face down on the counter like it was something dangerous, and for a moment I thought that was the hardest part, choosing silence when every muscle in me was trained to explain, to smooth, to take responsibility for other people's messes. But Evan was already a few steps ahead. He didn't pace or rant or rehearse speeches. He moved the way he does when he's made a decision and is simply arranging the world around it, calm and focused, like he'd been waiting for the moment when he no longer had to pretend. 2 days after Christmas, while most people were still relaxing in pajamas or returning gifts, Evan scheduled an emergency board meeting at the office. No warning, no agenda, just a single line in the invite that hit like a slammed door. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions. I watched him type it, watched him send it, and I realized then that whatever happened at my mother's table wasn't going to be handled with a family chat and a forced apology. He was treating it like what it was, a character reveal that had consequences. My parents arrived clueless. My dad looked confused but relaxed, probably assuming it was about end-of-year taxes or the quarterly reports he used to brag about being part of. My mom wore a blazer like she thought she'd be giving advice, the kind of blazer that made her feel powerful even when she was wrong. Vanessa tagged along again, even though she had no stake in the business, because she always liked being present for things that weren't hers. She treated access like entitlement. If a door was open, she walked through it as if it had been built for her. We sat in the conference room under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little harsher than they meant to, and Evan handed out documents to each of them, page after page of legal language that smelled like toner and finality. It was a formal buyout agreement. We were removing both of them from the company, effective immediately. No negotiation. My dad skimmed the pages like it was a prank he couldn't quite understand, flipping through too quickly, searching for the punchline. My mom didn't touch hers at all, just stared across the table at Evan with the kind of stillness that meant she was trying to control the room through silence. Evan spoke first, flat and clear, like he'd practiced saying it without any extra emotion. He told them the way they treated Sophie was cruel, childish, and telling, and if that's how they saw their own granddaughter, like a punchline, then they had no business being part of something we built for her future. The words landed heavy. I watched my father's expression shift, not into remorse, but into irritation, like Evan had broken an unspoken rule by bringing consequences into a space where my family preferred plausible deniability. My father tried to keep calm. He said it was a personal matter and had nothing to do with the company. Evan disagreed. He said the business was part of our family legacy, and people who humiliate a child in front of a room full of relatives don't get to benefit from that legacy anymore. My mother finally broke her silence and asked if this was about one comment. She leaned into the idea that we were overreacting, that it was a misunderstanding, and then she had the nerve to say she didn't mean it that way, as if intention could erase impact when the impact was a 9-year-old staring at her plate trying not to cry. Evan didn't even look at her when he said, "You meant it exactly that way." That sentence changed the air in the room. My mother's jaw tightened. My father's voice rose. He questioned the legality, the ethics, the optics, whatever he could reach for that sounded smarter than guilt. My mother warned this could affect our public image, like image was the only thing that mattered to her. And Vanessa tried to interrupt and talk over us like she was the voice of reason, calling it a family disagreement, saying we were acting like children, saying we were dragging Sophie into adult problems, as if Sophie hadn't been dragged first. Vanessa's tone turned sharp, almost gleeful, as she tried to make it seem like Evan was out of control, like he'd finally shown the controlling side she'd been hinting at for years. She called it pride. She said he'd always had a chip on his shoulder about where he came from, about being judged by my family, and she said it like she was exposing some truth, like the room should applaud her insight. I stayed quiet because I didn't need to defend him. His calm was the defense. My family was used to drama. They weren't used to someone who could hold the line without shaking. Then Evan stood up. He said the paperwork had already been filed, that the lawyers were informed, and their exit was happening whether they liked it or not. They could sign now and leave with dignity, or they could let the lawyers handle it the hard way. My dad stood up, furious, and called it betrayal. My mother refused to move, her hands still untouched on the table like she could refuse reality by not engaging with it. Vanessa tried her usual smug attitude, said we'd lost perspective, said we'd regret this, and then she made the mistake of glancing at me like I'd fold, like I'd step in and soften Evan's spine because I always did. Evan didn't give her that moment. He looked at all three of them and said if they weren't out of the building in 2 minutes, he'd have the front desk call security. No one expected that, not from Evan. Definitely not in that cold, steady tone, but he meant it, and my family could feel it. They left. My mother slammed the door. My dad muttered something about how we'd need them one day, the way people do when they can't win and want to plant fear as a souvenir. Vanessa called us delusional as she followed them out, still trying to sound superior even as she lost. The silence after they left was incredible, not empty, but clean. Evan sat back down like he'd just finished something he'd been carrying for too long, and for a second I saw the smallest crack of emotion in him. Not regret, but relief. We went home and Sophie was on the floor surrounded by Legos building a castle, like her world hadn't collapsed, like she still believed in structures that held. She looked up and asked if we could have pancakes for dinner, and Evan smiled and said, "Absolutely," like he was determined to give her a night that felt safe, even after the way my family had tried to make her small. Her drawing was still on the fridge, the one she made for my mom, who never even looked at it, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at it, realizing that meeting changed everything, but not just for them. For us, too. because the moment Evan chose to protect Sophie in a way my family couldn't manipulate, we stopped being participants in their system and became a threat to it. For a few weeks after the board meeting, we lived in a strange kind of peace. No calls, no emails, no unexpected knocks at the door. It felt unnatural, like the calm that settles in a forest right before a storm, and I kept waiting for the sound that would tell me it was over. At first, I let myself believe that maybe they were taking it seriously. Maybe the shock had finally forced reflection. Evan didn't believe that for a second. He said it felt too much like a storm that had dipped below the radar but hadn't disappeared. And the longer it stayed quiet, the more certain he became that something was coming. It started subtly, the way my family always did things when they wanted plausible deniability. A distant cousin posted photos from a birthday party we hadn't even known about. Everyone was there. My parents, Vanessa, cousins I grew up with, their kids all crowded around a table that looked eerily familiar. I recognized the tablecloth immediately. The same one I'd used for Sophie's last birthday, the same decorations down to the balloon arch. My mom had copied it exactly, like she wanted to replace the memory instead of acknowledging it. The caption read, "Family means showing up," and I stared at the words longer than I wanted to admit, trying to understand how someone could weaponize something so simple. Sophie noticed before I did. She came into the kitchen holding my phone, her eyebrows pinched together in that way that meant she was thinking hard about something she didn't quite have words for yet. She asked if she'd done something wrong, and my chest tightened, because no child should ever have to ask that question about people who are supposed to love her. I told her no, that none of this was her fault, but explaining why people she called aunt and uncle a month ago were suddenly acting like she didn't exist felt impossible without passing the poison along. I told her sometimes adults don't know how to handle their own feelings, and she nodded like she understood more than she should have at 9. 2 weeks later, Evan's phone buzzed during dinner. He glanced at the screen, and I saw his jaw tighten in that way that meant anger had gone quiet. It was a message from an old business partner asking if it was true that Evan's father-in-law was still presenting himself as being on the board at a Rotary meeting. Apparently, my dad had started hinting to people that he was still involved in an advisory capacity, just enough to sound important, just enough to keep a foot in the story. Evan didn't reply to the message, but I watched him cut Sophie's broccoli with more force than necessary, and I knew that was the last straw. The next day, Evan contacted our legal team and made it official. Any representation of involvement in our business, past or present, was now legally restricted. The paperwork went out with a firm deadline, 48 hours to sign or face litigation. Evan didn't want to drag it out, but he wasn't going to let them rewrite reality either. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth having boundaries. That weekend, Vanessa showed up. It was a Saturday morning, quiet in the way only early weekends can be. Evan and I were folding laundry in the living room, socks paired, towels stacked neatly, trying to pretend life was normal. Sophie was upstairs in her room drawing, the soft scratch of pencil on paper drifting down like background music. The doorbell rang, sharp and impatient, and when Evan opened it, Vanessa walked right in without waiting to be invited. That used to be normal in my family. It wasn't anymore. She didn't say hello. She launched straight into it, her voice already loud enough to fill the room. She said our parents were struggling, that my dad was humiliated, that my mom cried herself to sleep every night, and she made it sound like we'd taken away their lifeline instead of enforcing a boundary. Then she pivoted smoothly, like she'd rehearsed it, telling us we were raising Sophie in a bubble, that she needed her extended family, that cutting them off would cause emotional damage. She used words like toxic and abandonment, like she'd picked them up from therapy podcasts, without understanding what they meant. Then she made a mistake. She turned to Evan and said, "Let's be real. This is about your pride. You've always had a chip on your shoulder about where you came from." She said it like she was finally exposing him, like the truth was supposed to shame him into backing down. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Evan calmly told her this was the last time she would ever step foot in our house. He said if she showed up again, even to talk, we'd treat it like trespassing. She laughed at first, sharp and disbelieving, and asked if he was seriously going to call the police on his wife's sister. Evan didn't repeat himself. He just opened the front door and stood there, waiting. The silence stretched until it became embarrassing even for her. She left, but she didn't go quietly. Her last words before the door shut were that this family was going to turn its back on us one by one. And she wasn't wrong. Over the next few months, the invitations stopped coming. Birthday parties, baby showers, holiday dinners. Our names were scrubbed from group texts like we'd never existed. Sophie wasn't mentioned in posts anymore. One of the younger cousins unfollowed me on Instagram. Another blocked Evan entirely. My mother started telling people we walked away from the family, while my dad spun a version where Evan was a controlling man who isolated me. Vanessa just ran her mouth to anyone who would listen, always the loudest voice in a room she no longer belonged in. It stung, especially for Sophie. When Easter came and went without even a phone call, she asked me if Grandma was mad at her. I told her the truth, as gently as I could. I said Grandma didn't know how to love people who weren't perfect in her eyes. Sophie thought about that for a long moment, then said it was okay, because she didn't need Grandma to love her, because Evan and I did. I hugged her longer than usual, holding back tears I didn't want her to see, realizing that while my family was trying to erase us, my daughter was learning something far more important. By summer, my parents had adjusted. My dad found some consulting work through an old college friend. My mom launched an online store selling imported home goods she called artisan, though I knew they were wholesale. They weren't hurting, not really. And once they found their footing again, it became obvious. They didn't miss us. They didn't want us back. They wanted to win. And when they couldn't win by pulling us back in, they chose a different tactic. They erased us altogether. Summer ended without a single word from anyone in my family, and by the time the leaves started turning, it was clear we'd been completely cut out. No Halloween invite, no Thanksgiving plans, not even the passive-aggressive Christmas newsletter my mom used to send every year, where she'd list Vanessa's kids' GPAs and conveniently forget Sophie existed. We were ghosts, and for the first time in my life, I realized how much energy I'd spent trying not to be one. Sophie was thriving in school. Evan and I were stronger than ever, and I wasn't waking up each morning bracing for the next emotional landmine from someone who shared my blood. The quiet was different now, not peaceful exactly, but survivable. Then, out of nowhere, my brother showed up. Jake was the only one in the family who never really took sides. He was the youngest, 7 years younger than me, and had always been treated like a background character, quiet and agreeable, always flying under the radar. He lived in Portland, kept to himself, and never showed up for family drama. The last time I saw him was 2 years ago, at a wedding where we barely exchanged 10 words. So when I opened the front door in late November and saw him standing there with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a cup of gas station coffee in his hand, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, my first thought was that something was very wrong. He said he needed to talk. Evan hesitated for half a second, the kind of pause that meant he was calculating risk, then stepped aside and let him in. Sophie was at a sleepover, which I took as a small mercy. Jake sat at our kitchen table and didn't waste time easing into it. He said Vanessa was trying to sue us. I laughed at first, a sharp sound that surprised even me, because it felt absurd on its face. Jake didn't smile. He shook his head and said she'd been talking to a lawyer about emotional distress, about reputational damage, about how our decision to cut off the family had caused psychological harm, particularly to our elderly parents. She was framing it like we'd created a hostile environment and abandoned them, and from what Jake overheard, she'd convinced our parents to consider backing it with statements. Not because they wanted to, he said, but because Vanessa made them believe it was the only way to wake us up. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at Evan, and he looked back at me with the calm, resigned expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, like the escalation finally matched the tension that had been building all year. Jake stayed the night without us asking him to. We all knew why. In the morning, he admitted he wasn't just there to warn us. He wanted out too. Vanessa had moved into our parents' guest house after getting laid off, he said, and she was using their accounts to fund her lifestyle, calling it caretaker compensation. She'd been whispering poison into their ears every day, rewriting history, turning every kindness Evan ever showed into some controlling scheme, every boundary into abuse. Then Jake delivered the kicker, the thing that made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't felt since the Christmas table. Vanessa had already started sending emails to some of our clients, introducing herself as a family representative for the company, offering discounted rates, and saying Evan was planning to scale down and retire soon. She'd worded it carefully, Jake said. Just vague enough to sound credible, just familiar enough to feel legitimate. That was the moment Evan finally snapped. He got our lawyer on the phone within the hour. Cease and desist letters were drafted the same day. Vanessa's name was flagged with our partners, and warnings went out to every client she'd contacted. Each message was clear and clinical. She had no affiliation, no standing, and any further contact would be met with legal action. It was exhausting and infuriating and necessary all at once. That night, my phone filled with voicemails from my mom. Not angry this time, but desperate, begging us to be reasonable, insisting Vanessa didn't mean any harm, asking me if I really wanted to be the reason the family fell apart. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Jake stayed with us for the rest of the week, moving quietly through the house like he was trying not to leave fingerprints on a place he wasn't sure he deserved to feel safe in. On his last night, we sat around the fire pit in the backyard, the cold air sharp and honest, and Jake said something I hadn't expected. He told me he used to think I was the angry one, the dramatic one, the person always causing tension, but now he saw I was just the only one who told the truth out loud. I didn't know what to say to that. The next morning he left for a cabin he'd rented in Colorado, saying he wanted to start fresh, that he was done pretending. And with that, the last thread connecting us to my old family felt like it snapped clean. Or so I thought, because I hadn't heard from Vanessa in over a month, and that meant she wasn't finished. December came fast. No cards, no calls, no signs of Christmas. I should have been relieved, but the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like pressure building somewhere out of sight, like something was about to blow. Vanessa's email silence, her social media blackout, all of it felt too strategic, too controlled. Evan knew it too, even if he didn't say it out loud. He focused on tightening the company's security, digital and legal, while I started looking into homeschooling options for Sophie, just in case we needed to disappear for a bit. Then the storm hit, and it came wearing a gown and holding a champagne flute. The invitation came through Evan's office, not the family, which somehow made it worse. A charity gala, formal, annual, the kind my mother had helped organize every December since I was a teenager, back when I still believed proximity meant belonging. Normally, we would have ignored it without a second thought, but one of Evan's biggest clients was a major sponsor this year, and the relationship mattered. Evan hesitated when he showed me the email, his thumb hovering over the screen like he was weighing whether professionalism was worth reopening a wound. In the end, we agreed to go, not for them, but because we refused to let someone else's bitterness dictate where we were allowed to stand. We walked into the ballroom like ghosts returning to haunt the living. The room glittered with chandeliers and glassware, laughter floating above string music that tried too hard to sound joyful. My mother was there in a silver gown that caught the light every time she moved, laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny, performing warmth for people who didn't know her well enough to see the calculation underneath. My father stood stiff by the bar, shoulders tight, clearly out of place without a boardroom to hide behind. And then there was Vanessa, positioned near the entrance like she wanted to be unavoidable. She wore a red dress that didn't fit her, too tight, too bold, too obviously meant to be a statement. When she saw me, her eyes sharpened, and when they landed on Evan, she smiled. It wasn't a smile, it was a warning. The kind that says, "I'm not done with you yet." We didn't approach her. We didn't approach anyone we didn't need to. We spoke only to our client and his wife, kept the conversation short, polite, professional, and for a moment I almost believed we could pass through the night without incident. That illusion lasted until later, when our client gently pulled Evan aside near the bar, his voice lowered like he didn't want to be overheard. He asked about the rumors. Apparently Vanessa had been circulating, telling people Evan was stepping away from the company due to health issues, that we were planning to sell, that things were unstable, and the family was concerned. She'd said it with just enough vagueness to sound credible, the way lies do when they're designed to survive scrutiny. Evan laughed once, short and disbelieving, then corrected everything clearly, calmly, and professionally. He didn't name Vanessa. He didn't need to. The truth did the work for him. We left early, not in defeat, but because the air had turned heavy, and I didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of watching us linger. That gala was the last one we were ever invited to, not because Evan had done anything wrong, but because my family had poisoned the room just enough to make people uncomfortable choosing sides. That was always Vanessa's gift, creating chaos and then stepping back to watch others clean it up. January arrived like a reckoning. My parents sold the house, the one where Sophie was born, the one where Evan built the deck with his own hands, the one my mother once made me promise I'd host Thanksgiving in someday. They moved into a townhouse half the size across the city, in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew their name. My dad picked up more consulting work to keep the bills paid. My mom started giving online decor tips to retirees on Facebook, reinventing herself again, pretending none of this had touched her. The business money was gone. The reputation was unraveling. Vanessa's schemes caught up with her fast. The clients she tried to poach reported her. The lawyer she bragged about ghosted her. Her last desperate move, a GoFundMe for a wronged family in crisis, was flagged and taken down within 72 hours. But none of that stopped her from trying to lecture me one last time. She showed up at my office without asking, barged past the receptionist, and told her she was my sister like that still meant something. When she found me in the hallway, her face was tight with fury, eyes bright with the kind of anger that feeds on being heard. She started talking immediately, accusing me of destroying the family, of letting Evan turn me against everyone, of raising Sophie to be cold and miserable. She called me selfish, vengeful, dramatic, and then she said the things she'd been saving like a dagger. They're still your parents, Suzanne. One day you're going to wake up and realize you ruined everything over nothing. Evan came out of his office at that exact moment. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He pointed to the door and told her to leave. When she tried to stand her ground, said she wasn't finished, he said next time the police would be involved. She froze, looking at both of us like she didn't recognize who we were anymore, like the version of us she controlled had vanished without warning. Then she walked out. That was the last time I saw her. After Vanessa walked out of my office, something shifted so quietly I almost missed it. There were no more dramatic entrances, no frantic emails, no whispered warnings passed through cousins who just wanted to help. The noise didn't explode or fade with a bang. It simply stopped, like a machine finally unplugged after years of humming in the background. At first, the silence felt hollow, not peaceful, not painful either, just empty, like standing in a room long after everyone has left and realizing the echo is the only thing keeping you company. My parents didn't speak about Vanessa publicly anymore. They had bigger problems. Once their lives started improving again, when my dad finally landed a steady consulting contract and my mom began getting small interviews on local blogs for her decor advice, they adopted a new strategy. They erased us. No more jabs, no more accusations, no more guilt-laced messages pretending to care. We were simply removed from their story like a paragraph they didn't want to explain. They stopped inviting us to every family gathering. No calls for birthdays, no cards on holidays, no acknowledgement of Sophie's school awards, Evan's new contracts, or the new house we bought in a better school district. It was as if we'd never existed, and strangely, that hurt less than I expected. I realized they hadn't cut us out to protect themselves. They did it because they couldn't stand that we walked away first and never came back. It's been almost a full year now. No contact, no more messages, no more ambushes at work or charity events. Just quiet. They never reached out on Sophie's birthday, and that was the last test I didn't realize I was still hoping they'd pass. She turned 10 this spring. Double digits. We threw her a backyard party with her closest friends. Evan baked her cake himself, chocolate with strawberry filling, frosting uneven in the way that proves it was made by someone who loves you more than perfection. Sophie beamed the entire day, running barefoot through the grass, laughing without checking to see who was watching. That night, while I was cleaning up plates and folding napkins, I noticed something that finally broke the last thread tying me to hope. Sophie didn't mention my mom once, not when she opened her gifts, not when she blew out the candles, not even when she got tired and curled up on the couch with her blanket. She didn't ask why Grandma wasn't there. She didn't need her to be. I think that was the moment I truly let go. Evan had let go long before me. From the beginning, he'd said blood doesn't excuse cruelty, that family isn't defined by who shows up to hurt you and expects you to thank them for it. I held on longer, maybe because I was raised to think forgiveness was automatic, even when it wasn't earned, or maybe because some part of me still believed that if I did everything right, they'd become the people I needed them to be. But people don't change just because you wish they would. And they don't love better just because you keep giving them opportunities to. By the end of summer, they stopped even pretending we existed. They hosted a reunion in early August. Every cousin, every second cousin, everyone who ever mattered to them. We found out from someone who didn't realize we hadn't been invited. The caption under the group photo read, "The ones who always stick together." And to my surprise, it didn't sting the way I thought it would. It felt freeing, like the weight of pretending had finally been lifted from my shoulders. We still hear things sometimes, whispers from people who know them. My dad has become the go-to guy for semi-retired consultants. My mom launched a mentorship circle for women over 50. They act like nothing ever happened. Vanessa, last I heard, moved out of state. She sent Jake a cryptic email about starting over, but he never answered. I never got an apology. Not from any of them. Not once. But I got something better. I got peace. Our home is calm now. No tiptoeing. No walking on eggshells. No dodging barbed compliments disguised as jokes. Sophie has grown into herself without needing to perform for approval. Evan and I laugh more. We sleep better. We argue less. Not because life is perfect, but because we're no longer drained by people who believe love is conditional. I've learned that losing family doesn't always look like death or distance. Sometimes it's just finally being honest about the kind of love you never really received in the first place. They erased us from their story, so we wrote our own. And when I look at Sophie now, strong, bright, creative, unafraid, I know we didn't just walk away from something broken. We built something better.